Welcome to Southview Stories. I'm here with Olivia Walch. Olivia and I just met.
Like 5 seconds ago.
Like 25 seconds ago. But we have a mutual friend and colleague of yours. That colleague, I will give her a shout out, Dr. Kathy Goldstein. She's the one that made the intro, and she has described you to me as probably the most interesting person that she knows. And I was like, well, shoot, we gotta have this conversation on podcast, right? So thanks so much for coming out. Really appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here.
So we're just learning about each other right from the get-go. I told you a little bit about myself, but tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and how you got to Ann Arbor.
For sure. So grew up in Northern Virginia, went to college in Virginia, and then came here for graduate school in applied math. So Michigan has an applied and interdisciplinary math program.
Got it. And did you always know math was your thing?
Not at all. So actually, what happened was I graduated from high school. I was doing my undergraduate degree, and like week 2 of my freshman year, a professor, I think saw an email I'd sent being like, yes, can I get into this advanced math class? But I didn't want to do it. I just wanted like the credit.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, look at me. I'm a freshman. I'm taking this one. And he said, oh, do you want to do math research? I'm looking for somebody new to do math research. And I was like, yes, that sounds like an amazing resume line. And then I loved it. I loved it so much. I didn't know what math research meant. I'd done like biology research, which was a lot of like weighing the rats and then taking the rats off the scale. So research. I was like a high school lab assistant.
Got it. It was like when you, like for other people, when they get coffee for people.
Exactly.
That's weighing rats
Yeah.
in biology. Got it. So similar.
Yeah. Except I could like put like 3 rats on my arm at a time. I'd like be balancing them. And I cannot do that with coffee. But math research, I could do in bed. Okay. I could be really cozy. I could have like 10 blankets on top of me and like a notepad and be like, I'm working. And it's stuck. I loved it ever since.
That's great. So you came to Michigan for applied mathematics, and you got your PhD.
Yep.
And you are now doing your postdoc. Is that correct?
Yep.
And to get into that story, when we just first met 27 seconds ago now, you said if my 5 keywords, if we were talking like your website and SEO, your 5 keywords, you said, we'll talk about the first 3 first with math, sleep, and apps.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could tell the story about math, sleep, and apps to you right now.
Yeah. Okay. So sleep, I picked because it's one word. But really, the better replacement for sleep would be circadian rhythms.
Okay.
Which could be like a SEO term. That's like second tier, though. People don't know as much about circadian rhythms as they know about sleep.
Right.
But when I came to Michigan in the applied math program, there are a couple of researchers here who are really, really strong and work all the time in the mathematics of circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms, the definition is kind of tricky for its simplicity.
Okay.
A circadian rhythm is a biological rhythm that repeats itself about once a day.
Okay.
And it doesn't require anything external to drive it.
It's not just sleep.
It's not just sleep.
Okay.
I thought it was sleep. I like the kind of the way when you're learning stuff, you like say the wrong thing all the time.
Right.
So I was like, oh, the circadian cycle. And,
yeah.
And they're actually different. Okay. And so you might, for instance, feel like you're over jet lag because you slept through the night. You're like, oh, I'm adjusted because I slept through the night here. But it could just be you were so tired from not sleeping that you just slept in a big block of time, but your body's clock is still back in your home time zone. So again, like kind of hard because it's so simple. What are things that are circadian rhythms? So your temperature, your core body temperature has a rhythm. Goes up and down over the course of the day. It's noisy though. Like if you go for a walk, it's going to be like, wow, I'm really high right now. Your immune response picks up once a day. Your metabolism does different things at different times of the day. Your grip strength is strongest, I think usually around 5 or 6 in the evening for most people.
Really?
Which they do by having people come in and squeeze a grip thing as hard as they can. And they don't do it all at all points in the day in a single day. So they do this for like a month. They're like, come in at 9 a.m.
Okay.
and squeeze as hard as you can. And then like 2 days later, come in at noon and squeeze as hard as you can. But they have to use the same script to make sure they don't like accidentally say something that makes you really strong. So
or really angry.
Or really angry. You're like, well, you didn't say this last time, so
right.
I'm going to be really strong right now. So they yell the same thing. But when you do this, you yell the same thing at people over the course of a month at different times of the day. You see that people are strongest in the evening.
Oh, interesting.
And it's their circadian clock. You can think of it as perhaps your body doesn't want to try and do everything at once, so it prioritizes things.
I see.
And so the clock does all the stuff, but the most important input to the clock is light exposure, which is also unintuitive. I didn't usually used to think of light as like a big input to my body. It doesn't have mass. Yeah. It is literally not massive.
Plus in Michigan, especially in winter.
Yeah, there's no light. There's like a single photon and we all gather out in the streets to be like, we greet the photon.
That's right.
So circadian clocks are different, presumably in Michigan than in Virginia, where I'm from.
Right.
Okay, so they matter so much, but people don't really know a lot about their circadian clocks. I mean, did you like know most of this because you're Kathy friend?
No, no, I didn't. I mean, I guess I thought circadian rhythm was sleep or sleep patterns. But I did not know that there were other circadian rhythms or other ways to describe it. So no, that's super interesting.
It's like real cool.
But so where does the math come in?
Okay. So if I wanted to measure your circadian time right now, I actually couldn't use when you sleep for the reason of you might just be really, really exhausted when you fall asleep.
And as I told you earlier, I can fall asleep anywhere on cue. So
it's like a superpower.
It's pretty good. Yeah.
So I can't use that. Okay. So the way I would do it is I'd be like, Rishi, come to this dim lit room. About a couple hours before your habitual bedtime, and every half hour, I'm going to give you a cotton swab, and you will have to gargle it for 2 minutes. You'll have to be like,
okay,
and then you'll have to spit it into a test tube, and then I'm going to take those, because I'm going to do this for 6 hours, and ship them to Maine, and then in about a month, the people at the lab in Maine will email me and say, hey, his melatonin started to rise at like 9:30 p.m.
The melatonin from the melatonin gummies.
Oh, no. You won't be allowed this in the study. Yeah, so
okay.
You'll be like grasping for those and I'll be holding them out of reach. I'll be like, no.
Got it.
Because melatonin onset is a pretty clear marker of your body's time. It doesn't have the noise problems as much that temperature has.
Right.
So you have to do this really long, like 6 hours. Sometimes they do it for 24 hours. Expensive. Hundreds of dollars to run, test to get a single number. And it's the point at which melatonin, which is your body's signal for night, it's low most of the time, but then it starts to rise. And that rise point is the marker. So that sucks. It's really expensive. It's really time consuming.
Sounds boring.
It's super boring because you can't be in the bright light. If you're in bright light, it suppresses melatonin. So you're just like sitting in the dark for a really long time. But if I knew what time your body thought it was, I could tell you things. I could be like, hey, you're probably going to be pretty strong in a couple hours. Hey, you're going to be like really tired and stupid in a couple hours. Don't do important things then. Okay, so the experimental measures that exist, at least historically, a lot of people are doing really cool stuff with blood, but traditionally they have some downsides. But I said light is the most important input to your circadian clock, to the part of your brain that tracks what time it is. If I know your light exposure for like the last month, like 4 weeks of light exposure, and I know how the human body responds to light, which is that it advances in the morning and delays at night, which is, it's easiest to understand in terms of time zones. Like if it's 11 p.m. here, and I get a ton of light exposure, my brain's like, I thought it was 11. I must have been wrong. It must be like 8 p.m. And in the morning, if at like 4 a.m. I get a lot of light, then it's like, oh, I thought it was 4 a.m. But there's clearly light. It's clearly day. So maybe instead of 4 a.m., it's 5 a.m. And so
it's the light that helps your body apparently tell the time.
Yeah, exactly. And so if we know those rules and we've codified them in a math model, I can take your light history, run it through that math model, and then get a prediction of what time your body thinks it is without having to collect so many spit samples. Like you don't have to do anything. And like when I first started getting into this, the way I got light exposure histories was I asked people. I was like, in this hour, what was your light exposure? And
they were like 12. It was 12.
Yeah, it was on a 80-point scale. It was a 12. I think I had 5. It was like low indoor,
got it,
bright indoor. But now, so many wearables are tracking not necessarily light. There are like research things that track light, but motion. And it seems like motion is a pretty good proxy for light. Like it's definitely not the case that if you're moving, you're in bright light, nor is it the case that if you're still, you're in the dark. But it works pretty well to make that assumption with these math models. And you can actually predict somebody's melatonin onset to within an hour.
Really?
Which is really cool, just using wearables.
That is cool. And the wearables give you just massive amounts of data, right?
They do.
That's cool. And then, so the last keyword is apps. So where did you make the app fit into all of this?
So you know how I was like, people are submitting their light exposure to me every hour? That was in an app. And so the full story is my PhD advisor in 2014 had done work on the math of circadian clocks, specifically asking an optimization problem. So rather than trying to predict what time your body thinks it is, he was saying, let's say we know it perfectly, and you're trying to get from this time zone to this time zone. What is the best light presentation to do that? Which is like a calculus problem. You can be like, where's the maximum or the minimum of the function?
Right.
Zero. And he was like, hey, I've got some schedules people should follow. This should be an app. Can you make an app? And I said, yes, I could, because the summer before I had made an app called Bathroom Soundscape for Android, where if you hit a button, it would play a fan noise and it would animate a little fan. That's all it did. And I was completely unprepared to make an app for jet lag, but I said I was going to. It was actually the first app to do real-time circadian tracking. And
still exists in the App Store today?
Still exists in the App Store today. We have some like other people have caught on, and there's now beautiful competitors that I stare at them like gorgeous.
But this is the OG. This is the original.
The OG.
Right? This
that
is
was
the OG
me.
app. Yeah, for sure.
And so I made
it works best on the iPhone, like circa 2016.
No, 2014.
Yeah, okay, got it.
There can't be any of that iOS 7.
Right.
None of that. The response was really huge, like pretty, like undeservedly for the app, but deservedly for the idea, which is real-time circadian tracking. And so I updated the app in 2016, and I've actually, since I graduated, spun off a company that's trying to do real-time circadian tracking in apps for other purposes besides jet lag. So there's this field that's emerging called chronotherapy, which is the idea that if your immune system is doing something at some times of the day and not others, your metabolism is doing something at some times of the day but not others, you should time your medication so you get maximum efficacy and minimum toxicity.
Oh, wow. That's super interesting.
I think so.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
So the idea is to track people's circadian clocks on their phone so that they can take treatments when it's best.
So when we take twice a day, it's just twice a day. You just pick your time. We pick the time you're eating, morning or night or whatever it might be. But in reality, it could be twice a day because these two times are best for you based off your rules. Super cool.
Yeah.
So one of the other, I think, super interesting things about you is this keyword of comics. And, I think unfairly so, we think of PhDs in applied mathematics, and we don't think artistic, and we don't think comics for sure, right? But that's a big part of your life, and you have web comics online, but I didn't know this before when we were talking, or what I'd known about you. You actually have this experiment, this project you're working on involving gerrymandering and comics. I thought you could talk a little bit about that.
For sure. Okay, so comics I've done forever, just like doodling and margins here and there.
Because to be fair, you're a math major, so I'm sure there's a lot of doodling time.
Yeah. Once in like high school, I drew pictures of dolphins instead of like X and Y. Like it was obnoxious, but it was like I'm solving quadratic formulas, except instead of X, it's a dolphin.
I'm sure the teacher appreciated that.
I don't think so. Okay. I think they probably have my face on the wall and are like, why?
Yeah.
What was she trying to prove? but I love drawing. And I also really like explaining ideas in comic form, especially because I learn the stuff better when I draw a comic about it. And so I did one about neural nets, and I was like, oh, now I understand neural nets. But about 2 years ago, I saw an advertisement for a academic conference about the mathematics of gerrymandering. And it was happening at Tufts in Boston. Yep. And I applied as an educator. I'm like, I'm a graduate student who's taught people, and also I draw comics. And they flew me out there with a bunch of other people to just talk about the math of gerrymandering.
And did you know much about the math of gerrymandering before?
No, I totally didn't.
You knew math, but not gerrymandering.
Exactly. Okay. I knew a little bit. Like I'd been interested in this like distant way, but I went there and I learned a ton, and I left and I was like, well, I want to learn this better. And so I drew a comic about it that was like pretty long. It wasn't just like one panel. It was like this whole sort of comic narrative about the state of math and gerrymandering at the time, which like things have changed since then. I really need to do an update to it. And kind of the way I'm doing that is I'm co-editing this book about the mathematics of gerrymandering. It's called Political Geometry, but I'm putting a lot of comics in there along with like writing a chapter sort of about where things stand. And that's all kind of like summarizing the work of other people. I also have a project with a friend of mine at UCLA that's actually taking stuff he originally did in his thesis and applying it to redistricting.
Oh, interesting.
And a way of thinking about that is just like, imagine you make the boundaries between districts fluid and you just let them flow. You have like a flow from like a stressed out, crinkly state to a smoother, like chilled out state.
Got it.
And
You're
that's
not super concerned about the lines and let it flow through.
Yeah, like not super stressed about like preserving, for instance, county lines. Just being like, let's see what happens.
Got it.
But if you try and do that without sort of extra work, because there's a bunch of ways in math to be like, just let something flow. Just let it flow.
Math sounds super like laid back and chill the way you describe it.
You're hella cozy all the time, just letting things flow, making apps.
Just making apps, fan apps. Yeah, that's great. Oh, nice.
Bathroom soundscape. Yeah. Like, this is a backtrack. It got me some of my favorite app reviews ever. Like exactly what I needed. I didn't work hard for that at all. It was just a single button and an animation of a fan. The gerrymandering research though, kind of tackles this problem of if you're letting things flow, sometimes population is not preserved, which is pretty important for districts. And in fact, usually population is not preserved. Sometimes the population of a district disappears, goes to zero. Or you'll have something that like started out like a barbell, like a blob, and a thin thing and a blob. And when you let it flow, it just separates, which you don't want for a district.
Yes.
And so that's the stuff we work on.
That's super cool.
How to flow without screwing up what makes a district a district.
Right on. And do you find yourself, I mean, you have these interests and these projects you work on that are what most of us would think of as very disparate, and integrating them together, is that, how does that work for you? Is that fun for you?
It's so fun. It's definitely made me better at everything.
Yeah.
Like there are obvious exceptions where I'm like, oh, I stayed up late drawing comics and now I'm bad at math. But the like overwhelming way it has worked out is I just reach a stopping point on one thing where I'm like, I'm frustrated, I'm stuck. I do the other thing.
Yeah.
And then while I'm doing that, whatever got clogged up is cleared. Yeah. And I come back to it and I'm like, And it's really easy to get frustrated on comics where you're just like,
I can't draw anymore.
Yeah, this doesn't look right. This idea isn't right. Then you just, I don't know, think about math, code something, because coding is great. Because then you just get to code and you're like, I did a thing.
Yeah.
Like there's no like blank, unknowable expanse like math and the blank page. You're just like, look, I did a for loop. It's there, accomplishment. And then you have that to like motivate you and like give you a boost on the next thing.
Interesting. All right. So before we go, all of these things are interesting, but I was told, and I forgot to tell you about this when we talked before, so this is on the spot, that you have a great take on why your work is open source.
Oh, For sure, yeah.
And so I forgot to mention that, so I apologize. But you're going to run right into it and tell us what your take is on open source, because I heard it's a great one.
I mean, I hope so. I hope live up to the hype. You can't do
I got the note over text, so it wasn't that much hype. But yeah.
So the kind of math I do is building models, and being like, hey, these equations, they describe the human circadian clock. They do this.
The equation is important. It's
Yeah.
secret sauce.
We're at the point now where you can't summarize a model in a few lines. It's just not possible. The work that would go into re-implementing it on your own is so great. There's a lot of typos in a lot of papers, and like it's like really easy to make a mistake when you're like doing this kind of stuff where you have like
one wrong variable here,
and it might not even be a typo. It might be a mistake in your results. Like the paper might be entirely wrong, and I think that fear of having a paper be totally wrong, which like you don't want to think could happen. You want to think that everyone's like checked everything out, and I don't think this happens often. But it's like it's a real risk. Like you just like the fear has kept people from putting things online, and you just have to stop that now, because like the only way the field is going to advance is if other people can take your stuff, warts and all, and work with it themselves.
Make it better. Second set of eyes, or 100 sets of eyes.
Yeah, and also just like it's like the ultimate form of honesty. Like you have to be honest as a researcher, but it's so easy to lie with math. It's so high dimensional. You could be like, for this specific set of parameters, the result I want happens. And if I tweak something 2%, everything breaks. Everything shuts down. And you're not lying in the paper because it works for that parameter set, but every other one it doesn't.
In the real world where it needs to flex back and forth, it doesn't.
And like a lot of other fields have caught on. Like I don't think people in machine learning would take it very seriously if you're like, oh, I've got this like incredible new result that none of you can have. But in math, bio, the stuff I do, it's not the norm. It's not standard. And I think the thing that's scary is like, what if I put my code online and there's a mistake? What if people think my code isn't good enough? And they're like, wow, what an idiot. What idiot produced this code? And there are people who will be like that. There are snobs. But you have to like open yourself up to that criticism, because the field will otherwise not advance. And Kathy, who told you about this, was specifically talking about a project we worked together where I extracted raw signal from an Apple Watch from sleeping people, and just built classifiers, things to say, hey, okay, you weren't moving a lot, but your heart rate was going crazy. Probably in REM sleep right now. But we did it all in this open source way because I want somebody to do better than me. I don't want somebody to find a typo, but you know, if it happens, I'll be like, well, I'm glad for science. But what I want is for them to take it and do better.
Got it.
And I think there's definitely so much ground to do better. There's so much out there that can be done with.
But what about the how do you check your ego? How do you check the fact that like, but I started it? Like, how do you keep that, or how do you keep your hand in that a little bit?
You just like sit back and you're like, I'll know.
Dude, math, I guess I just didn't realize how chill math is. It's just like very...
I mean, it's not. There are like big egos, but it kind of is. Like, for instance, author order matters a ton in biology. Like first author, last author, nobody's.
Yes.
In math, it's alphabetical.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's just like,
That's smart.
Yeah.
I like that.
Aaron Aronson, you go first.
Well, I will say that definitely in my top 5 most interesting people. So the hype is real. The hype is real. And math is chill. That's a new one.
Let that be the takeaway. We're all wearing sunglasses and riding around on skateboards.
Let it be the takeaway. So, thank you so much, Olivia.
Thank you for having me.
All right,